Today we have a pleasure to meet Tamsin Edwards, a climate scientist. She's specializing in quantifying the uncertainties of climate model predictions. She is a scientist, but most of all for us, she's the person who really inspired us. We had the pleasure to listen to some of her talks and her tips, thoughts around the ambiguity of our world. We found those very, very interesting, and we thought we could learn as designers from her. So this evening is to share reflections and to find the parallels that she...
Thank you for the brief introduction, but I will just say, you know, what a pleasure it is when you're approached to give a talk and people send out such a thoughtful and personal email. And I was really touched to have that sort of connection with you watching my talks and the kind of personal ideas you had for what you'd like to talk about tonight, and thank you all for coming, you know, giving up some of your evening to hear a climate scientist. It might not be an obvious thing to do if you're working in service design, I don't know, but yeah, thank you so much. I will just say, although I work a lot on thinking about the future of the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, sadly, I've never been out to either because all my work is computer modelling. And so I get to take the data from all the people who do go out on the glaciers around the world. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I will share my screen to start. And I wanted, I think really because of that lovely sort of thoughtful invitation, I wanted to really write a talk, you know, for you, not just kind of give a talk that I'd given before. And you helpfully sent me through an article, a blog post by Rob Maslin, who I think is here in the call today. And as you'll see, that formed the kind of the basis for what I want to talk about, which is why I have this title, Life-Centered Design, Skills for an Uncertain Future, because I'm really trying to find some parallels between, I guess, the language of your field and the kinds of things you're thinking about and my world of climate change. And I want to start with this idea of uncertainty, and not so much the future, but thinking first of all about the past. So in early 2018, I was diagnosed with cancer. And so, of course, that introduces an unbelievable amount of uncertainty into your life. So I wanted to kind of reflect a little bit on that, as I have done in some other talks, but particularly in relation to your world, what lessons or what reflections or parallels I might draw from thinking about uncertainty when I had cancer. Of course, that was the past, but we live now in a very uncertain present with coronavirus. And again, there were sort of a lot of strange parallels with the time that we're living in and the time that I had cancer and chemotherapy. And so I'll kind of pull in a little bit of those ideas and reflections as well. And then with a view to thinking about what we can learn for an uncertain future, and particularly climate change, perhaps more broadly the environment in terms of pollution and ecosystems. I'll mainly focus on climate change because that's my area. And my starting point for the talk is really this quote from the post by Rob, who's chairing Saturday's session on panel on sustainability. And he asked in this post, how might our skills in service design change when design is not just human-centered but life-centered? In other words, considering both people and planet. And then there was a link to an article on 5 skills for becoming a better service designer. And I clicked on that out of curiosity, ironically, because one of them was curiosity. the article was by Mark Fontaine from last year, and the 5 skills that he mentions are really things that resonated with me about the kinds of things I like to talk about and think about with climate change in the future anyway. The quote here is taken from the article. Curiosity is all about enjoying exploration and getting pleasure from finding interesting questions. And of course, that's very much the case. I think I'm a great believer in getting people interested in how the climate works and how the planet works as a way of drawing people into thinking about climate change in a way that feels more empowering than not understanding or focusing on the challenges alone, but really thinking, well, this is a fascinating world, and understanding how the climate works in itself is of value, and it's not just about solutions, but also about curiosity. And then, of course, this quote really struck me. A great service designer, of course, has to think about surprises, has to prepare for surprises to happen. And this was my surprise. This is a graph of my weight in late 2017, early 2018, and in the autumn I started having IBS type symptoms, and also on top of that vomiting and severe stomach cramps. And it turns out that unexplained weight loss is a symptom of bowel cancer. So I had colorectal cancer in the colon, and then by the time it got to about here, so in sort of mid-January, that had been diagnosed, and I had emergency surgery, a hemicolectomy. So they took out half of my colon, which of course means I have a semicolon. And, you know, that was something, as a relatively vegetarian, I was going to say relatively young, certainly for the sort of normal bowel cancer demographic, female, not sort of red meat eating person, it was definitely a surprise. And of course, we see every day surprises in the world, and this is of course the current West Coast US wildfires. Tremendously sad, awful situation they're facing with the fires themselves and the danger of that, and also the air pollution that they're seeing. I'm sure you've seen many amazing, striking photos such as this. And we can think about surprises, but we can also think, well, how surprising is this really? This is, sorry, I'm struggling to change the slide for some reason. Focus has gone off my window. Let me exit and come back again. Oh no, that's okay. Are they surprises? Well, you know, we understand the climate, you know, we understand that the world is getting hotter, and so it's not surprising that the vegetation would be drying out more, and that there would be more of a situation that can help with triggering wildfires. This is a map from a very good website I recommend called Carbon Brief, which has articles on climate news stories, kind of briefings and explainers. I use it a lot in my teaching, actually. And this is a map of different types of extreme event around the world. And the different symbols show kind of what they relate to, what sort of weather event or anything else. But the important thing is the colour, where the red symbols are types of extreme event where studies in scientific studies have shown there to be some human influence on how likely those extreme events have increased in time, and also how severe they are. And it's actually about 70% of these symbols show human influence, and Western US wildfires is one of them. So this is one of the studies over that time period where it was shown that they were more severe or more likely to occur because of climate change than human influence. And coronavirus too, aside from knowing that pandemics can happen, that these animal to human virus transmissions can happen, also the unequal impacts of coronavirus could have been predicted in hindsight. So I'm sure you know that the people have a greater impact of coronavirus on their health. They are less likely to survive if they live in an area of high air pollution. So that's an impact that could have perhaps been predicted. But in terms of inequality, of course, in many parts of the world, in the US and the UK, I've seen studies certainly where, of course, people who suffer from structural inequalities are more likely to live in areas that are near industrial areas, poorer areas where the pollution is not a priority for the local people, for the local say government or regulation. And so that's, of course, one of the factors why Black people and other people of colour have been dying more from coronavirus, is this structural inequality of living in areas of air pollution and therefore suffering greater health impacts. And that's something that really that we already knew about. The second skill in the list from the article is communication. And this really struck me because obviously we think of communication as important anyway, but the specific mention of storytelling. This is a slide, this image is something I use in my lectures, and it's certainly something I hear a lot increasingly actually in my research meetings. So not just thinking about communication of challenging science to the public, but also how do we use storytelling, stories and scenarios to improve our predictions of the future? Because really a story is about helping us to imagine the future and different possibilities to obviously something like science fiction, of course, is one example of putting ourselves into different worlds and thinking what would it be like to live in that world, whether it's dystopian or utopian or anything else. And I've certainly found in general, but particularly since I had cancer, that it's so powerful to use the idea of storytelling in talking about climate change and talking about uncertainty and uncertain future. These are a couple of examples that I've had. This first quote is from a book chapter I wrote. Culture and Climate Change Scenarios is a book you can find online. There's a free download you can get, where I talked about that day that I had that diagnosis of colon cancer. And of course, at that point, you're told things like your prognosis odds and what the chances are that you will have the cancer come back in 5 years, that you'll survive for 5 years without disease. And I drew parallels between that, being in that situation, and thinking about the uncertainty of climate change and the uncertainty of whether we would meet the Paris Agreement. And more than that, I wanted to draw a parallel not just between the risks of cancer and the risks of climate change, but also the trade-off between challenging solutions that carry their own risk or perceived risk. Because the chemotherapy treatment that I had, Folfox, is one that the more you take of it, particularly beyond 3 months, the more likely you are to get neuropathy, which is nerve damage in your fingers and toes. And that can be permanent. And so, of course, as someone who types all day for a living and plays piano for a hobby, that was very important to me. And that trade-off of the benefits of chemotherapy for the negative impacts and the risks of the neuropathy was something that I had to grapple with, and something that changed through time. At the beginning, I perhaps didn't worry so much about the neuropathy, but once it started to hit and feel tangible, it became more important. And climate change is something where certainly there are perceived risks of a low carbon transition. People fear for a change in their livelihoods, in their way of life, standard of life. It's an unknown, And also just actually some of the solutions that we put into place for climate change can have unintended consequences, negative impacts if we don't think about things like sustainable development, if we don't think about things like equality and equity, and that we can end up causing other problems even if we're tackling climate change. One big headline example of that is geoengineering by trying to reduce sunlight coming in to the planet from the sun. It's a bit of a drastic example, but that's something that carries its own risks. And just it made me understand a little bit more that trade-off in the risks, and that to experience the probabilities and the uncertainties personally when the uncertainties and probabilities of climate change feel quite remote, was very it probably changed the way I think, I guess, about risk and probability. And I talked about that on the statistics program Radio 4, more or less. This other example is the polar thinking blog post that I wrote. I think it's still my pinned tweet, and there's a Blue Dot talk that I gave, the Blue Dot Science Festival that I gave, based around that blog post. And it was a slightly different way of thinking about stories and parallels between the cancer and the climate change in my research, which was a couple of things. One was about making predictions for two possible scenarios for Antarctica, that it might collapse very rapidly and cause very rapid sea level rise, or that it might not, and that we didn't yet know. We had to hold both possibilities in mind that might seem very different and maybe even contradictory, because we didn't yet know. We had to hold both. And also the idea that we might have predictions that are somewhat good news, somewhat bad news, that they are better than we previously thought but still bad, or that there's ambiguity in that we don't live in a simple world that we can classify things as good or bad, or simple. And we can do the same of thinking about different stories for the future in climate change. So there are really probably two ends of climate change in terms of warming that we're going to see. So at the low end, we have 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, which would be consistent with the aims of the Paris Agreement. And we can think about how that would affect people around the world. So at 1.5 degrees of warming, we'd have twice as many megacities exposed to heat stress, and tens or hundreds of million more people exposed to heat waves. That's something that would be difficult to completely adapt to avoid that vulnerability of health impacts of heat stress. But then with a 4-degree world, which is at the high end of the predictions under high emissions in the future, that there are studies that show there could be some parts of the world where some days of the year we actually exceed the limits of human survivability. So we wouldn't be able to stay outdoors for a few hours because of not really just the temperature, but the combined increase of temperature and humidity, which would make it difficult for us to cool ourselves down enough by sweating. So the humidity stops that sweating to cool us down. And this was a news article based on the terrible heat waves in India last year, basically considering this possibility that we can see that future as being a possibility. And we can think more broadly about the impacts in terms of poverty. This is something that's very multidimensional and complex: food security, water security, and so on. And even at 1.5 degrees of warming, the predictions are that tens to hundreds of millions more people could be exposed to climate risks that impact poverty, and at 2 degrees up to 1.2 billion. And these are very, very wide ranges, mostly actually not because they're influenced by our development scenario. So the story that we choose for the future in terms of a more sustainable development versus less will have a really big impact on these numbers. And the regions that would be most affected would be Africa and Asia. You can see here, this is a map of a sort of best case scenario of food security, food insecurity, where a lot of the regions are worse than today. A few are better, but most are worse. And you can see the impacts that are the regions that are impacted there. I work in sea level rise. Again, we can think of these two ends, these two possible stories of the future. This shows predictions of sea level rise for the future for up to 2100, 2200, 2300, showing, for example, that this century, if we stick to if we go up at the high emissions end, so the upper curve, we might reach 1 metre of sea level rise this century, which would have big impacts on coastal flooding around the world. And if we limit ourselves to the low scenario of 1.5 or 2 degrees, that would be half or a third of that value. And then looking longer term, if we manage to keep to the Paris Agreement long term, that might limit the sea level rise to about 1 metre. But if we didn't and went up the high emissions and higher emissions without doing anything, which hopefully seems pretty unlikely that we'll do nothing, but in the very worst case scenario, that could end up with several meters. So of course the natural question is, well, which future is it going to be? And this is a website that I often use, which is updated every few months, which makes predictions for our current trajectory for warming based on our emissions and our policies, our energy use, and our a little bit better than that, our pledges and targets, which are not yet policies. And at the moment, that's showing about 3 degrees of warming. So basically somewhere between the two, a little above the middle of those two scenarios. And of course, we want that to come down and down to 2 degrees and lower. One thing that gives me a little bit of hope is every time I revise my slides every year for my teaching and these talks, it does go down a little bit. So I think it went down 0.2 degrees in the last year. So the arc is bending slowly. The third is facilitation. Being able to handle and use group dynamics to get a team to achieve the best outcome in as little time as possible. Well, we really do have as little time as possible. If we look at what we need to do to keep to 1.5 degrees of warming. This is a graph of, in the left-hand side is the past CO2 emissions. So if you just focus on the upper curve, that's the total of our CO2 emissions. And then on the right-hand side is what our emissions need to do if we're going to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And you can see one thing, for example, is that they go down to 0. And in fact, that's not zero emissions, it's net zero, which means that we are still emitting some CO2, but we're also extracting CO2 from the air just as quickly. And that could be through planting trees. It could be through chemical methods of extracting CO2 from the air. And there are other methods as well. And in fact, they end up with net negative. So we have to pull more CO2 out of the air than we put in the last parts of the century. And you can see that the curves bend downwards more quickly than they've been going up. So we have to decrease our emissions faster than they've been increasing. And the IPCC report on this basically described this as requiring rapid and far-reaching transitions. And I think this isn't a surprise. In energy land, urban infrastructure and industrial systems, this is something that has to affect every decision that we make. And of course, unfortunately, the longer we wait, the harder it gets. And it already has got a lot harder. This is a graph showing the kind of shape if we'd started in the year 2000 really cutting emissions. There's a very shallow slope. That's the yellow one. And of course, now we've left it so late, the slope gets very steep, and we have to use more of the CO2 extraction to help to get us down that slope. And that has great challenges in terms of things like having enough land for forestry. The chemical engineering methods are possible, but still expensive. And there are lots of challenges with that, of course. But we have seen rapid change, global rapid change, of course, with coronavirus. This is a graph of CO2 emissions since the pandemic. That red drastic dip is even steeper than the one I showed before. So, of course, I'm not suggesting that we should maintain our current pandemic lifestyle, because it's very, very painful for a lot of people around the world, economically, socially. But we do know, and this is a quote from Mary Robinson, who was the president of Ireland in the 90s, that this at the moment collective human behaviour is protecting us, and we can believe in that as a possibility, and that we can act in that way to protect each other as well as ourselves. But of course, when we're thinking about designing the future, and this is something that you will have all thought of in your work, I'm sure, is a few different questions. Who is who is being designed for, who is being centered in this human or life-centered design. You know, we know that there's been a lot of interest over the years in replacing cook stoves in less developed countries to reduce the air pollution that they face in using wood in small confined spaces, and to reduce CO2 emissions, but also a long history of not asking the women what they actually want. How do they cook? How quickly do they need to heat water? What kind of space do they live in? How do they live? And therefore the cook stoves failing and not being used or breaking down in some way. Another gendered aspect of design or of thinking of women's needs is this amazing statistic that perhaps a quarter of women in low and middle income countries don't have access to the family planning that they want to either delay or prevent pregnancy. And if we met that need, which which is a simple need for those of us who live perhaps in the UK and can easily obtain family planning and contraception, that could reduce maternal deaths by tens of thousands of people, of women. Not only that, who's being centered, of course, in the design, but who is doing the designing. And there's a study last year that showed greater female representation in parliaments leads to stronger climate policies and lower carbon emissions. But there's only about 30% women in the big international agreements, the COP, Conference of the Parties, like the Paris Agreement. The sort of bodies that act on the aspects of the agreement are underrepresented in terms of women. And similarly, in terms of racism, in terms of people of colour, environmental organisations historically, typically are predominantly or majority overrepresented in terms of white people in the organisations and underrepresented in terms of people of colour. This is a graph showing for the US various environmental organisations, and if you go to the website, you can see that getting worse with increasing positions of going higher up the power structure within the organization. And not only that, but it's important to think about who's driving change, who are the engineers of change. And I don't underestimate the power of the youth movement on climate change. I do think Greta Thunberg and the school protests have been extremely important in changing the conversation on climate change. And this is a bunch of young women, young female teenagers protesting. I happen to know the one in the middle. She's the daughter of a friend of mine. So, there's a high representation of women in these. And also in the US, there was a study actually showing this group of teenagers is very white, but in the US, actually Black and Hispanic teens are really showing the majority of climate activism in terms of protests, rallies, school walkouts, and contacting government officials. So there's a survey there showing, that it's young people of color in the US that are demanding change. Improvisation is all about feeling when to let go of your initial plan and act accordingly to what the moment and context needs. And I looked at that and I thought, well, what we call that in climate change is resilience, is adaptation. And of course, it's important to think about, where does resilience come from? Where does the capacity to change and be flexible and improvise come from? Well, I really felt the difference for resilience when I had cancer, because I really could see very clearly the ways in which my different privileges helped me to cope with having cancer. So aside from having cancer, in every other respect, my life was perfectly set up to deal with it. So this is a picture of me having chemotherapy in one of the best hospitals in the UK, which is about half an hour walk from my house, free, of course, in the UK. I was accompanied by my partner. I had a support network. I had friends come to chemotherapy. I had of course, the education, particularly the scientific education, to access good information and even the original scientific literature to understand my illness and my chemotherapy. I had the confidence to ask questions from doctors, to ask for clarifications, to challenge what decisions were being made, and of course I was taken seriously, both as a scientist and probably as a white woman as well, and all of these things and more, financial stability in my job and so on, really helped me to be resilient to cancer and to, relatively speaking, cope with it really well. And so we've got to think about how can we make people resilient? What is it that they need? What resources do they need to be resilient, to have the extra capacity to cope when things change and when things become uncertain, and not to be constantly at their breaking point or at their edge. So, for example, if you're not able to cope with extreme weather, then as that extreme weather gets worse in the future, of course, you're only going to become more vulnerable. And I wrote an article drawing parallels of the resilience in cancer and coronavirus here, which is really thinking about how the experience of cancer had prepared me, I guess, for the pandemic period. Lots of parallels in terms of an uncertain and fearful future, obviously fears for health, and particularly the lack of control. Lots of people have struggled with the lack of control over their life and the change in plans, which is something that absolutely had happened to me before. With a diagnosis like that, obviously just everything stops and everything disappears from normality. I like this quote from the same Mary Robinson panel that I watched. Science was seen as about statistics and abstraction and icebergs melting. So I work on icebergs melting in my research, not how we live and our relationships and inequality. COVID made this inequality clearer. So just like cancer made my privilege clearer, COVID has made the world's inequalities clearer. And so really we have to have design for the future, whether it's economic stimulus, whether it's products, whether it's process, that absolutely embeds the low carbon transition throughout, because of that scale of the change that I showed, that rapid systemic transition, but also includes the most vulnerable, because those people might not be in the room. They may have caring responsibilities. They may have poor health. They may have other challenges, and we need to make sure those are considered in the decisions that we make. Because of course, cancer, coronavirus, and climate change are all amplifiers of injustice, of inequality. Gender and race are two examples of that. So a disproportionate number of the chronically hungry people in the world are women. A small number of agricultural decision makers are women. Climate change also amplifies racial justice problems, inequalities. You can see here, for example, that people who were needing to evacuate New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina hit, well, if more than 30% of Black residents didn't own a car, that obviously is a terrible impact and inequality in terms of extreme weather. And I saved the final skill for last because I think it's the most important: empathizing. And it's something I talk about a lot. Seeing the world from someone else's perspective, being able to connect with them, being a more active listener instead of just a speaker, being patient and deferring judgments. And I think the more we can try to live this, the more successful we are. Because we live in a more and more polarized world. This is a very clear graph of that. The most politically active Democrats and Republicans, showing on the sort of political scale, over the decades have become more polarized, have become more different to each other. And we know that we live in a world of them and us, of seeing people as the other, of seeing people as heroes and villains, of the good guys and the bad guys. And climate deniers are dangerous to our children, is this poster. But over the years, as I've talked about climate change to the public, and particularly tried to talk to climate skeptics about why they're skeptical about climate change or action on climate change, I've inevitably become friends with some of them, because we're humans and we have different interests and we have respect for each other's views, even if we disagree. This is one of my favorite examples. When I had chemotherapy, I got given a present by a climate skeptic. He asked his sister to crochet a portrait of me. I did have slightly more turquoisey bright hair at the time. And this is a climate skeptic who I don't even know his full real name. I disagree with him on climate change, but there's a human connection there. that's incredibly important, for allowing those conversations to happen about why does he not agree with me on climate change? What is it? What are his values or his sources of information that mean that he doesn't agree with me? And you'll never be able to have that conversation if you can't empathize. And avoid seeing the world in black and white terms, in overly simplistic, polarized terms, and instead see the world as it really is, of course, in nuance and shades of grey. So my final sort of quote that relates to this is one that I love, that I heard this year from Chief Rabbi Sachs, about how we deal with deep uncertainty about the future. He said, we have a system for dealing with the unpredictable. It's called character. It's called virtue. So that when something comes up that you never ever thought would happen, it matters that the person making the decision has wisdom, has prudence, has courage, has humility, has openness to other voices. And I think that's so, so important. So if I was to try and draw all of that together in a few lessons across these uncertain futures, one is to really deeply accept the inevitability of uncertainty and to be really clear about that in communications and decisions, but know that we can reduce the risks. We can monitor the warning signs of our bodies, of the planet, of the conversation. We can study the past to understand the future, otherwise we're blind to what the future will bring. So we can understand attribution of extremes to know that wildfires will become more likely. And we know that we can reduce the impacts of climate change now by confronting and reducing and getting rid of inequalities, because it's climate change amplifying those. And so if we reduce those and remove those inequalities, then we're already reducing the risks of climate change now. And really to deeply acknowledge the scale of the change, that graph of plummeting emissions, that the low carbon transition has to be in every single decision that we make. It has to be the water in which we swim. And at the same time, we have to remember everything else. Of course, we have to remember equality and sustainable development, who is being centered and who is making the decisions. And finally, that point about being open to other voices, but not just the ones in your own group, the people that you find difficult, the people you disagree with, the people you think are very different to you, the people you think are crazy or stupid. Actually, if you listen to them, they've got reasons for thinking the way they do. They've got their sources that they trust. They've got their ways of life they want to preserve. And really a plea to challenge them and us thinking. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tamsin. Normally it would be a great and loud applause, I think, but we can stretch ourselves and let's clap.
Thank you.
You can also use, of course, the digital sign of it, which is a little bit less funny, I guess. Thank you, Tamsin, for sharing. It's a very unusual evening for all of us, especially meeting here in the digital room. I would love to invite everybody to ask questions, and please to make it a bit more, real. Switch on your video and switch on your audio, and let's just be here together. So, are there any questions from our lovely community?
Or comments? I'd love to hear what people think in their own work. Whether there's anything that sparks a thought from there.
I'll kick off. That's all right.
Yeah.
Am I on mute? Can you hear me? Hello. I'm just interested that the point you're making about that us versus them. I think that's something that's sort of stuck with me and struck me. I was just wondering, in those kind of conversations you've had with climate skeptics, has there been anything that they've said to you that's kind of changed your sort of mindset or view on things?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, a lot. I mean, first of all, that basic point that climate skeptics are some sort of weird other, nefarious, evil sort of person or idiot. A lot of the climate skeptics I talk to actually are, there's no one single climate skeptics. There are people who think CO2 isn't a greenhouse gas, right through to people who basically accept most of climate change but don't really agree with large scale government regulation, for example, to tackle it. But I do talk to a lot of people who are perhaps actually scientists and engineers and things in other fields, so clearly not stupid people, that are obviously kind and warm and wonderful. And that sounds like an obvious thing to say. How should we be surprised by that? But it's amazing how, particularly of course on Twitter, how you see people treat others like, I don't know, like animals, really, like children, to be ignored and brushed off and told off, and you must win the conversation, and yeah, and also scientifically, I mean, we have plenty of examples of climate skeptics saying, oh, well, I'm not quite sure about that method that you used there, and is that robust, and prodding the science and saying things that are valid. And it takes time to unpack the good points from the less useful, but it's there, and it's important not to just give a broad brush. So yeah, I definitely have, and I think I'm better at understanding why people are skeptical, where it comes from, there are lots of different reasons, and what it is that they're prioritizing instead, or what it is that's caused their distrust, but also the importance of deep scrutiny of your own work, and of admitting when you're wrong, and not being too defensive actually, and saying, well, we know everything and we're never wrong, and trying to cover up if you're wrong. I think it's important to have that humility there as well. Thank you.
I have a question as well. You've mentioned that on a daily basis you are trying to keep in touch with skeptics. I always wonder, do you practice a little bit just coming out of your bubble? How do you stay positive about those challenging conversations? Do you have any tips?
That's a great question. So I guess first of all, in terms of the bubble, I very much make sure I don't have one. So I follow people I disagree with a lot, across political spectrums, not just on climate change, but all the big challenging issues. The really important thing is to get in the room with people, and obviously that might mean a virtual room like this, but face to face is really important. Human communication, when you have voices and facial expressions, is unbelievably different from text by Twitter and all of that. So yeah, there was very early on, I had sort of cup of tea and a cake with some skeptics, and they were so sweet and kind and thoughtful about everything, and then they sort of gently and sort of amusedly disagreed with me about lots of stuff, and I managed to convince them of a few things maybe, and I think the main thing that I try and practice, and the main kind of root of why I try and put this at the heart of what I do, is probably I've decided that my dad was a psychotherapist, and it's because I guess I've been deeply brought up with the view that if someone is behaving in a way that you view as bad, difficult, challenging, in that sort of way, trying to understand the root of that, just immediately think, well, why? Why are you thinking that? Not just to judge the action itself or the viewpoint, but to think, well, where's this coming from? Why is it that this person is thinking this or doing that? And to deeply think that those reasons might be valid. There's a lot of talk about people acting in good faith or people acting in bad faith. But I mean, most people are acting in good faith. It's just they're coming from different values and different information and different priorities than us. I'm not denying that some people are actively and willfully difficult, but even they have got potentially reasons in their background why they might be acting that way and in that challenging way. So I think that always taking that as the first starting point, and that maybe the final point actually is kind of to shut up, that idea of listening, active listening, because people always say, what do I say to climate skeptics to change their minds? And it's not, it's what you ask. It's what you listen to. It's what you are open to hearing from them about their views. And that in itself, not only is it good learning process for you and more likely to change their minds, but it diffuses a lot of the tension, because if you listen to someone who's coming up to you all sort of huffy and cross on Twitter about climate change, and then you take them seriously and you listen, and then you acknowledge the points where they're right, and then ask them about this other thing, and then, you know, have a conversation instead of tell them stuff, often they kind of, oh right, oh, that's, you know, I didn't expect that reaction, and actually the anger is gone.
I wonder if anybody in our room would like to share any, you know, stories as such. Have you had recently a difficult chat with a person with completely different point of view? How did you tackle it, or would you like to share?
Well, I actually have a question that's not about that. I was thinking about, first of all, Tasmin, that was just a great thought-provoking talk, and I'm really going to go back to the video of it and watch it all over again.
Thank you.
I was thinking about the quotation from Rabbi Sachs, I think it was, and I'm thinking, what kind of groundwork do you think needs to be done to prepare people, and in particular young people who are the torch bearers of the future? How do we prepare them to be people of character? You know, to have those embedded virtues that the rabbi spoke so eloquently of. But how do we do that work, that groundwork?
Wow. Yeah, that's a tough question. I think obviously it will depend on the angle that they're coming from, because of course even by early teens people have quite strongly formed opinions based on their family and their school and their experiences and their culture. And so, for example, if someone was not very engaged and didn't think climate change was very relevant to them, I think those twin sort of ideas of curiosity, so that's slightly taking away the guilt and the political and the I want to say the sort of depressing side of climate change, by kind of inspiring, like, oh, this is like just interesting, and maybe I can become an engineer, or maybe I can become an oceanographer or something, so, as a way of engaging, and also the people who are the kids who don't feel engaged in climate science but care about people, and talking about those impacts on people and justice is incredibly powerful. I mean, you know, there's a very strong, I think, sense of right and wrong, you know, at that age. And then I guess for those that are already very concerned and engaged, I think it's about helping them not to lose hope and to stay engaged and so on with the challenge. And that sometimes involves bringing in a bit of that nuance about how you think about the problem, because I think people sometimes get into thinking, well, it's all doom, or humans are going to go extinct, or, you know, what's the point of anything, because it's all so terrible. But actually, if you say, well, some of the things you're reading are those very worst case, that 4-degree or 5-degree warming world, we're already doing better than that. The world is already better than those worst case predictions, or we are already seeing change. And it's not fast enough, but it's not a brick wall. Too many people say nothing is being done on climate change, and that's not true. And some of that is not necessarily action on climate change for its own sake, but more because the world has finally acknowledged in the last couple of years, I would say, including big business, big banks, that the low carbon transition is inevitable. So even if they're not doing it because they care about climate change, they're doing it more in a game theory way of, well, everyone else is changing, we don't want to get left behind. It's happening. And I'm having lots of conversations with lawyers inside businesses or other people saying, you know, this is happening. And so I think we can keep young people hopeful by saying, the fact that they refuse to work for companies that don't have a climate strategy is having an impact. They are saying that, the fact that they are suing companies for the climate change that they're causing, it is having an impact on the legal systems in those companies. They are considering whether they're going to get sued in 10 years for the emissions they are not reducing now. They are getting sued by their shareholders for endangering their assets because they're going to become stranded if it's a coal power station. So I think there's that idea that yes, we can always do more and we should be doing more, but not to lose hope that nothing is being done and nobody's listening and nobody's doing anything, but really just to say, well, it's hard and it's complex, and so it's about keeping on and moving, taking that arc of emissions down and down and down and chipping away and chipping away. It's not failure and winning. It's a constant ongoing process. Thank you.
That was, yes, super challenging, I would say.
Yeah, amazing question.
After a day of work for everybody, I assume. To all of our participants, I think there is somebody.
One more question.
Yes, please do so. I was just going to say that feel free to ask more. We understand that our session was planned to run until 7:30, but we are prepared to, continue this discussion. And if you have any other places, people to attend to, we say goodbye, but otherwise stay with us. So who comes next? Please. Oh, I can't see you all. That's so funky. Please take your voice, whoever you are.
Hi, we can see you raising your hand. We just don't know what your name is.
Please go ahead and ask.
Please, go ahead.
Nikhil.
Hello.
Can you guys hear me? Hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk, Tamsin. I could completely relate with your analysis of what's happening in India. My parents live in Jaipur, which is basically scorching right now. So I had a question, and I deal with not just people not believing in climate change. I sort of work in the climate change work. I'm building a startup in the space of disaster relief. Mm-hmm. So climate change is a big part of that conversation. And one of the things people do come back to me is this blatant denial of climate change. Now, what I find is the belief isn't so much binary, as you said, it's just different elements of it. But those elements also fall under the spectrum of a weak belief versus a strong belief. Now, and I find the weak belief, when presented with evidence, might change, but a strong belief often is not there from logic or fact. It's just there because it's there. It's almost like a religion. It's not going to change. So, and there's a significant number of people who sort of fall into the brackets. It's not a number that you can avoid. So how do you tackle those situations?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really big conversation in sort of climate change communication. There's lots and lots of evidence that the more you challenge someone's views, the more entrenched they become.
Exactly.
So I think there's two things. One is certainly in the kind of public domain, like Twitter or a panel event or something, I see value in talking to someone, even if I don't think they can change their mind, because of the people that are watching, who might have more weakly formed opinions about it and think, oh, that person seems reasonable and maybe I can win them over with the things that I'm saying. And then with people who do have stronger opinions and are quite entrenched already, it's so clear that confronting them and trying to win the conversation is not going to help and it's not going to work. And so what you have to do, I think, is create a space for them to change their mind in a way which has kind of dignity and saves face, right? Because the thing that humans hate is to be wrong, hate to be told what to do and what to think, and they hate to be wrong. So if you can find a way to articulate the conversation in a way that allows them to shift without, but still saving face, I think that's really important. And it's hard to explain without giving a particular example, but it's clear that just trying to throw facts at someone is not going to work. If you can, either through sort of ambiguity. Actually, I've been told I use kind of constructive ambiguity as a way to get people to sort of feel like they're agreeing perhaps slightly more than they are, or to come to a place of agreement, because you're expressing the conversation in terms that that appeal to both sides, rather than defining it so clearly that they realize that they're separate. And that can kind of bring about this. The article that I'm thinking of, I'm always interested when I manage to do something that gets kind of people saying they like it from both sides. And there was an article I read in The Guardian about lukewarmers. And lukewarmers are, a few years ago, lukewarmers are people who believe in climate change but think it won't be that bad and that we can deal with it with a bit of technology and things. And it was around that article where some people were saying, oh, well, Tamsin doesn't seem to be being very strong on climate change, and she seems to be being a bit sympathetic to lukewarmers. Actually, it was much more about trying to articulate the problem in a way that both sides would agree. So if you're interested, have a look at that article, and that's trying to do what I'm talking about. And it's clear that you have to make a space in which you can create an avenue for them to say, well, now the evidence has changed, I've changed my mind, or now that we have talked about it and I see it like this, I've changed my mind, rather than, that there's something new in the conversation, rather than just they've suddenly realized they're wrong because you told them they're wrong. Does that make some sense?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm going to look up the article, lukewarmers. I like the term.
Yeah, see what you think. Yeah, see if it makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you once again. The link is in the chat, and we have a question from Pooja. Wait, I'm sorry if I am pronouncing your name in the wrong way. She cannot unmute herself, but she's asking, she's wondering if you could talk a bit about your view on time when it comes to climate work. Asking because I have been reading and engaging with indigenous views of generational time rather than the capitalist notion of more fast break things. Climate change is important work, so do you take a slow or fast approach to innovation?
Thank you. It's a really interesting question. I think we have to work at both scales, because I think we have to acknowledge the increasing risks that are happening in the coming years and decades, or that already exist in terms of extreme weather, and the long term. And sea level rise is a good example of that, because coastal flooding is going to increase in the short term as sea level goes up. But the prediction of climate change that that I work on, that I also find one of the most shocking, is that we might, certainly with Antarctica, be coming to a point, or we might reach a point where we lose so much ice from the ice sheets, we trigger an instability and a self-sustaining loss of parts of the ice sheet, which would take hundreds or thousands of years to play out, not just in terms of the sea level rise, but in terms of how long it would take to regrow that ice sheet and to replace it again by waiting for the snow to fall. And that, the replacement could be thousands, even to tens of thousands of years if we left it long enough. And both timescales will affect different people at different times. People will worry about the short term, and they will need something like a wildfire happening in their state to connect with them, with the risks of climate change, the immediate. And some people will think that moral, ethical dimension of actually losing great parts of the ice sheets that take hundreds to thousands of years to play out and to replace. I think it has to be both.
Okay, I think I saw a hand. Was that Rob?
Yeah. Thank you, Tamsin. It was a really great talk.
Well, thanks for the article that helps spark.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm really, really pleased that you picked up on the article. I'm flattered, actually. It's really, really nice mention. It's not something I anticipated at all coming into, into this session.
Put you on the spot a bit there.
Yeah, but I think it's a really good example of what happens when you find inspiration in unexpected places. And I think that's the kind of stuff that innovation and creativity thrive on. I think we kind of need more of this. I think design could really do with stronger links to scientists and science and climate science if it wants to tackle some of the climate change and sustainability problems, which I think the world kind of needs designers to do that, not just because we can solve the problems, more because we're actually a force for bad things at the moment, and actually we need to kind of focus less on doing the bad things and more on doing the things that are actually positive. And actually we had somebody from the last year we looked at a panel discussion that I was on, and it was looking at the subject of service design and sustainability, same as what this year's panel is on Saturday. Same subject. How can service design build its capability to answer some of the sustainability questions? And one of the panelists was a industrial designer by background, but working with the British Antarctic Survey. So he works with scientists quite a lot, but said to me that you know, he struggled to try and get real traction with scientists, and the arts does generally, because it's sort of dismissed as a bit fluffy and yet this is kind of where the communication comes in, how we can communicate better to the general public and sort of humanize some of the scientific facts. So my question is really, I guess, around what design can do to try to connect with scientists a little bit more, and what language can we use, how can we communicate to engage that group of people and strike up more collaborations.
Thank you. I think it's some of it is about finding the right scientists, in the sense that, you know, we're not all the same. Some people are wanting to really focus on their particular computer model, lab experiment, fieldwork, and aren't reaching across the kind of disciplinary boundaries. One of the reasons I do a lot is basically I come from a family of artists, and you know, kind of nearly kind of went in that direction myself. And you'll find actually a lot of the scientists that do science communication have got some kind of performing arts background, I think, like music or something. So that can be quite common. So even just reaching out to the ones that are doing a lot of public engagement, they're likely to be more open to those kinds of crossover conversations. There's more and more, you know, over the years, I get asked more and more to have collaborations with artists, and I see other scientists doing that. So there's definitely, we're working on at the moment like a sort of installation where you go and experience the weather of, you know, 150 years ago, of today, and then a sort of 100 years from now, you know, the different temperatures and things, and working with a resident artist. And I think in terms of, you know, those analogies and metaphors and things that I enjoy kind of trying to pull out those parallels and those similarities between fields. Some of it will be those sorts of scientists, some of it will be about another intermediary again. I mean, a lot of what I've learnt about people and how they react and cultural responses to climate change has come from psychologists and social scientists, for example, and they can be a good bridge as well. And in terms of, you know, the reason I kind of wrote a talk specifically for tonight and sort of really engaged with your field is partly actually the connection that, you know, that Eva and others made by being very specific about the human connection of my Blue Dot talk and of the cancer and of those kind of issues, and really reaching out, you know, in that personal way, rather than saying we just like some predictions of climate change on a few PowerPoint slides. You know, I think it's about what kind of partly about knowing what you want as well. As a climate scientist, I get asked to do quite a range of things, and sometimes people want sort of any climate scientist to come and talk about climate predictions. Sometimes they think they want a climate scientist, but really they want someone to talk about policy or specific energy solutions or specific policy tools. And then sometimes, like tonight, people say, well, we want this very specific thing. So I think it's partly about knowing what you want and how to approach people with, and find people with those similar interests. Does that help? Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think I think one of the things that I found really unusual about your talk is just the ability to make it quite so personal and link it back to your personal experiences, but then also look at the kind of macro level and link it back to the data science. And I think that the narrative and the storytelling was, it's really well done and well structured.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot out there. I mean, probably you'll find that female climate scientists are doing more of that kind of work of linking the personal, I would say, to the climate science and the political, just in terms of the examples of people that I can think of. I don't know whether that's a greater comfort with doing that or a greater expectation that we will do that, or a greater positive response. It's harder for men to maybe do that, and easier. I mean, it's become easier with the cancer. It's sort of pulling the cancer card, it's a kind of, it's a very direct route into kind of quite big emotions and quite large issues around uncertainty. And I get a lot out of having those conversations. I find the positive responses and the support that I get from people responding to that has been powerful as well. It's not, it's not a one-way thing. Yeah.
Well,
I have another question, if I may.
Okay, so we have also Rosie. So let's go.
So I'll wait. I'll be in line.
All right, Rosie then.
Hi there, Tamsin, thank you so much for your talk. And yes, just to say how making it personal is obviously an incredibly effective tool for communicating it. And I guess that's the emphasis that I'm interested in. I have two different questions, so I might ask both and then you could decide which one you prefer to answer. I'm currently writing or researching a book on weather and climate change. It started being about weather, and then we saw pretty quickly that there's no point writing about weather without climate change, but it's focused for 8 to 11-year-olds. And we're trying to strike a balance between the reality of what's happening and not trying to give them nightmares. And part of that, what would you recommend talking to a younger child who perhaps isn't maybe old enough to go on marches and things like that? What can they personally do to give them a sense of control about combating climate change?
Sorry, do you want to ask?
Oh, yeah, I'll ask the other one, and then you can decide. So discussions I more have with adults, with people who don't believe that climate change exists. One of the key arguments for that is that the climate has clearly gone through enormous changes for millennia. We've been through ice ages, etc. They're not convinced that this increase in temperature and change in weather is anything more than one of those standard fluctuations. Is there what would, in a conversation, what would you ask them, or what would you say to that?
I'd probably be interested to know, I'll come back to the other question after, where they got their information from, and sort of unpack that a little bit, particularly because I'm sort of familiar with the different, say, blogs out there or that sort of thing. And I think, I mean, I probably sort of kind of gauge how receptive they were to kind of unpacking some of the science. I mean, there are sort of fairly compelling ways of talking about attribution of climate change that aren't really talked about that much in the public. So, for example, the sort of, it depends a little bit how entrenched they are, because if they've gone and read a load of blog posts from climate skeptics, they'll have got kind of answers to all of these, and they'll have got rebuttals to all of these. Whereas if they just kind of have a vague sense that it's all fine and it's all a bit nonsense, then I'd probably go more down the explaining a bit of the science type, something with someone like that. Whereas if it's someone who's very entrenched in the blogosphere that already has an answer for all of those, like someone with the flat earth, they always have specific answers for every possible, and that's all well practiced and well sort of documented. And in that case, I probably wouldn't try so hard to convince them in a way about the science. It would be more like, well, what, showing that people are trying to come up with solutions for climate change that improve other aspects of the world, or whether it's poverty, or whether it's not being reliant on other countries for fossil fuels, or whatever I would ask whatever their values are that they care about. There will always be a way to link in climate change with that, because climate change is so broad and so encompassing. So whatever they care about, whether it's ecosystems and species, wildlife, whether it's pollution, whether it's poverty, whether it's their own backyard, there will always be a way, but it's finding out what they care about first, probably. And then in terms of kids, I think, I definitely come back to the curiosity side of things, of learning, that obviously you're tackling anyway with the existence of the book. And also I think there's probably too much emphasis with kids and with the public on personal actions, in the sense of feeling a great responsibility that if you left the lights on, and people get confused with plastic as well as an issue between climate change and plastic, and they're quite separate in a lot of ways. And people get so wrapped up in their own specific personal actions and some of those will have knock-on bigger effects through consumer actions, but really it's structural, right? It has to be structural. It has to be political systems, and it has to be big corporations and banks and finance that have the big levers. And so the more that they can either, obviously with the school walkout, they got out and made their voices heard, even though they can't vote by doing that, whether it's writing to their local supermarket, or whatever it is that actually is getting them to tackle the structural stuff and the systems stuff and the big lever stuff, rather than feeling guilty about their own consumption specifically, or only that, then I think that's more useful and hopefully more positive as well. I'm not saying don't encourage lower emission living, obviously, but I think it's really important to absolutely tackle the big stuff, and that might be how can they do that? How can they make a fuss in a way that businesses care about? And they are listening. They are, to some, many businesses are listening anyway. Many politicians are listening.
Thank you. Sorry, I was greedy and asked 2 questions, so I really appreciate you answering both.
That makes sense.
Oh, I really want to be respectful of our time, but most of all of your energy, Tamsin. So do you still have energy to answer one more question?
If there's one more question, I think that will, and then probably I should go after that. Haven't cooked supper yet, so it'll get a bit late. Yeah.
So Carol.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm afraid I'm also a bit greedy. So Rosie, you're not alone. I'm thinking about continuing along with the idea of bringing our personal stories to climate change, and listening to all that you've said about the increasing risk of climate change. I'm wondering if we can actually win this race. I'm having serious doubts, because in the back of my mind, as I try to push it back there, it keeps popping up. And it's this question of, or this, well, it's not a question, it's a reality of population growth and how explosive it is. And I'm wondering if all that we're trying to do to bring that arc down that you showed us, can we do this if in our own backyard it just keeps filling up and populating more and more? I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, of course, the predictions that we make, including, I'm sure, the Climate Action Tracker, include population growth, right? It would be crazy if they didn't. So that 3 degrees, for example, of our current kind of trajectory will already include that. And I don't feel it's a very helpful road to go down too far down the low population argument, because I do think it is about justice and equality and distribution of resources and a better way of living. We're not going to solve any problems if we just slow the population growth alone. We have to do everything else. Now, like I talked about with family planning, there might be co-benefits where you meet the needs of women in a way that also reduces population growth and has that knock-on impact. And I think that's a positive way to go if you have both motives in mind, I guess. But I think we can't. I don't think we should go down the road of thinking, well, if only there are fewer people, it'll be okay, or that's the main factor. Because really, I do think it's about reducing the per person emissions. And if you look at the US, for example, they're way out ahead of other countries or other major countries on per person emissions, and that's unfair. And if they're on 2 or 3 times more emissions and consumption than people who live in India or even the EU or anything, then that's something that's, if you get their emissions down by a third to other people's levels, then I think that's a better way to go. Yeah. I mean, I just think, I guess it's I guess I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's yeah.
Thank you for this piece of optimism. I guess we are all crumbled from time to time in between those, is it possible? How should we do it? Are we really doing it? All those questions that I know that majority of my colleagues working both in design or other industries, they keep them awake at night. So I think it's good to at least chat together and share those concerns and charge our energy as well together. So once again, thank you for the parallels. Thank you for this really chilled and reflective evening together. We do appreciate it as designers, non-designers. There are a lot of different people among us. And please stay in touch.
Thank you for hanging on late as well. That's really kind.
Cool. So once again, I guess if there are any questions, you can find Tamsin on social media, you can reach out to her. And yes, this is her handle on Twitter. Katie is sharing that.
Chat messages.
So enjoy your meal, whatever you are having.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming and your really thoughtful questions as well.
Do you have any questions maybe for us? Would you like to?
I think I'll leave it there. But I've had a lot from the questions. I really appreciated them a lot, and I hope what I said has been hopeful. And I'm sure if you had another climate scientist along another time, they'd have a whole bunch of different things to say as well. I think we don't all think in the same way about how to go about things either. So I think that sort of getting a broad range of opinions from different people is in climate science and policy is a good idea as well. So I'm sure your Saturday panel will be really interesting in a different way as well. Yeah.
Thank you for that. As service designers, we are always looking forward to diversity of opinions and perspectives. So once again, enjoy. Thank you so much. And that was a really lovely start of SDFF 2020. Thank you all for joining us, and see you during the next session, which is tomorrow, exactly the same time, 6:30. See you soon.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.